Hey there. Tonight we're doing something a little different. You've wandered into a part of the medieval world that most textbooks prefer to skip, a world of whispered rules, secret punishments, and deeply personal rituals that were anything but private. You're about to explore a time when the most human parts of life, intimacy, desire, connection, were scrutinized under candlelight and cloaked in doctrine. But don't worry, this isn't a lecture. It's a quiet story, a gently winding path through ancient expectations where even love had a curfew. And before we get started, if this kind of sleepy history helps ease your mind at the end of the day, you're welcome to subscribe, but only if it feels right to you. I'd also love to know where you're listening from tonight. What's the weather like where you are? Are you curled up in bed or just letting this play in the background while the room darkens? Now just settle in. Maybe pull that blanket a little higher, and let's begin where very few ever look first. Not in a battlefield nor a banquet hall, but in the bedroom. Or at least where the bedroom used to be centuries ago, behind thick wooden doors and under tapestries that never quite blocked out the cold. You might think this was the one place where people could act freely beyond the eyes of the church, or the gossiping eyes of the village. But you'd be wrong. Even here in marriage and privacy, in the supposed sanctity of a home, there were rules, quiet ones, unwritten sometimes, and sometimes written in the boldest ink of all fear. The medieval church didn't just regulate belief or behavior. It regulated love, or rather, how it was expressed when and with what intentions. Intimacy between husband and wife was not a private affair. It was monitored, scheduled, and scrutinized, as if it were a sacrament that could be easily defiled. Theologians debated which days were acceptable for marital duty, and which days were sinful. And if that sounds intrusive, well, welcome to the Middle Ages. By the 13th century, marital intimacy was officially discouraged on over 100 days per year. That included not only Sundays and feast days, but also the entire season of Lent, the 40 days before Christmas, the Eve of Communion, and curiously Wednesdays and Fridays. Why? Because Fridays were the day of Christ's crucifixion, and Wednesdays were considered penitential. Some monks believed that a child conceived on a Friday might carry a mark of sin not visible, but spiritual, a quiet stain on the soul. It gets stricter. Theologians like St. Thomas Aquinas warned against approaching intimacy with too much joy. Pleasure, he argued, should never be the goal, only procreation. Anything else risks sliding down the slope of moral decay. Husbands were expected to be firm but not affectionate. Wives obedient but not enthusiastic. Love was permitted, but desire was suspect. It was as if any flicker of warmth had to be filtered through layers of guilt and duty. There were rules for positions too, though not always written plainly. Church writings implied that anything other than what we now call the missionary position was improper, if not outright sinful. One 12th century manual advised against behaving like beasts, and another warned that turning one's partner over was to mimic the demons. Of course, this language wasn't about biology. It was about control, spiritual and social. The church's deepest concern wasn't that people would act improperly, but that they'd enjoy it. And yet beneath all the fear, there was still human nature, still people, still you if you imagine yourself back there. Maybe married at 15, maybe with a spouse chosen by someone else. Maybe scared, maybe curious. You wouldn't have been handed a manual, just a string of expectations wrapped in silence. A mother might whisper a warning. A priest might deliver a vague sermon. And if you were lucky, you might learn through whispered gossip behind the bakehouse. But if you misunderstood or misstepped, well, that could cost you everything. The church could assign penance. Your neighbors could shame you. And worst of all, you might begin to believe the guilt yourself, carrying it not just in your mind, but in your bones. Some confessions recorded from the period mention husbands sobbing while recounting excessive affection for their wives, One man fasted for 30 days because he allowed his wife to kiss his cheek more than once. Did these people truly feel shame, or were they just afraid of being seen? Historians still argue whether these rules were universally followed or only sporadically enforced. After all, rural peasants may have had more pressing concerns like food survival or making sure the roof didn't collapse. But in towns and courts, and especially in monasteries, the pressure was real. Manuals like the Penitential of Bede or the Decretum Gratiani laid out penalties for even the most personal missteps. And here's a rather bizarre tidbit. There was once a proposed calendar, possibly circulated by overzealous monks, that calculated there were only 44 safe days in the entire year when intimacy was fully permitted. That's fewer than the days you're allowed to fish in a protected river in France today. Even the language around these acts was carefully restricted. Medieval people didn't talk openly about the body, not even in writing. Instead of saying someone was pregnant, they might say she was heavy with hope. Instead of saying a couple shared a bed, it was, they lay in the Lord's intention. Euphemism wasn't just poetic, it was protective, a way to navigate social expectations without inviting scrutiny. And so you imagine yourself living in a small stone cottage, hearing the church bell ring out the feast days, the fast days, the forbidden days. Your partner leans close, and for a brief moment you forget the calendar. But then a voice, perhaps your mother's, perhaps a priest's, echoes in your head. Not tonight. It's a vigil. You'll invite demons. And just like that, the moment slips away. You might ask, why did people accept this? The truth is, many didn't, not quietly anyway. They adapted. They whispered. They kept secrets. But for those who tried to follow every rule for the deeply devout, the uncertain, or the simply terrified life could become a series of carefully counted days, each one colored with quiet doubt. Yet as heavy as these restrictions were, they weren't the end of the story. Across villages and cities, people still fell in love, still married, still held hands under cloaks, still left tokens beneath pillows. They worked within the rules around the edges, and sometimes they broke them gently with a glance or a note, tucked into the folds of a sleeve. And you, if you were there, would have done what people have always done, found ways to feel human in a world that feared humanness. So tonight, as you lie back and listen, maybe you'll carry this thought with you that even under centuries of rules and rituals, people still longed, still hoped, still tried. Because no matter how many days were forbidden, there was always a night like this. It's strange, really, how something as natural as longing could be seen as a kind of moral infection, as if desire itself were a weed that had to be plucked before it took root. But that's how the medieval mind often worked. In the world you've just stepped into after the bedroom came the judgment, and not necessarily from your spouse. No, the eyes that watched you closest were often the ones you couldn't see at all the saints, the angels and the God whose silence was always loudest when you were most vulnerable. You're still in that dim cottage, or perhaps now in a monastery cloister, its corridors echoing with the shuffle of sandals and whispered prayers. Here desire wasn't merely discouraged. It was considered a spiritual threat, a danger not only to your soul, but to the delicate balance of the community around you. If one person fell into temptation, others might follow. That was the logic. So the solution was to police not just behavior, but thought, and to cast the net wide. The passion was suspicion. Affection, if too visible, became cause for alarm. And yet you might still feel it. That flicker. You pass someone on the way to morning mass. A glance lingers. A breath catches. You kneel and press your hands together in prayer, but your thoughts drift elsewhere. You try to imagine heaven, but it's their face you see. Their voice, not the choirs that echoes in your memory. And then the guilt sets in. Not loud, not immediate, but quiet like cold seeping through your sleeves. In the medieval worldview, this wasn't just a passing thought. It was a crack in your armor, a weak spot where sin could creep in. Church fathers like St. Jerome and Augustine wrote extensively about the dangers of unchecked desire, especially among monks and nuns. Augustine famously described how even in his most devout years, he was haunted by dreams. Dreams that felt too vivid, too physical, too real. He wrote about praying for a release from temptation, not because he didn't feel it, but because he felt it constantly. Desire then became something to be fought like a demon. And that wasn't just metaphor. Some truly believed lust was a literal demonic force, a presence that could whisper in your sleep or cloud your senses. In one monastic rulebook, it was advised that monks should sleep in separate cells, wear rough wool against their skin, and avoid looking anyone in the eyes for too long. Even certain foods were thought to inflame the body. Garlic, onions, and wine were sometimes restricted, not for health, but to avoid stirring the blood. And this fear wasn't limited to the religious. In village life, too, passion was a dangerous thing. A husband who showed too much affection might be called weak. A wife who blushed too easily was said to be too warm of spirit. A widow who smiled at a neighbor might find herself the subject of whispered rumors in the market square. There were codes unspoken and sharp, and breaking them didn't always lead to formal punishment. But the social costs could be just as brutal. One curious case survives from a town in 14th century England, where a couple was summoned before the parish priest, not because they had sinned, but because they were seen laughing together too often in public. When questioned, the husband explained that they had been sharing stories from their childhood, recalling a long-ago spring when they met. The priest wasn't amused. He recommended 3 days of separate penance and advised them to find joy in prayer instead of the flesh. Historians still debate whether this kind of strict surveillance was widespread or limited to more pious communities. Some suggest that among the peasantry, especially in remote areas, people were more relaxed. But in towns and church-run parishes, particularly where bishops held sway, these attitudes were deeply embedded. And even if not every community enforced them harshly, the fear that they might was often enough. And then there were dreams. Ah, yes, the dreams. You might think you're safe in sleep, but not in the medieval mind. Dreaming of someone in a certain way, that too was a sign. Some penitentials' books used to guide confession, listed specific penances for unwholesome dreams, especially if they occurred more than once. One man confessed to dreaming of his neighbor's wife 3 times in a week, and was told to fast for 7 days on bread and water. Another case involved a nun who dreamed of a golden-haired angel who visited her nightly. She was reassigned to a colder, darker cell to cool her soul, the abbess reportedly said. And yet, despite the weight of all this, people still felt things. You still would have. How could you not imagine again that glance at morning prayers? You meet their eyes for a moment too long. They lower their gaze, but you sense they felt it too. You spend the next day whispering the psalms, but the lines all blur into a single face. That night you sit in your straw bed listening to the wind outside the soft bleat of goats, the creak of old wood, and you wonder for just a moment what it would be like to reach out. But you don't. Because the fear isn't just of being caught. It's of disappointing something higher, something you've been told watches not only your hands but your thoughts. There was even a belief in some circles that excessive affection within marriage could lead to spiritual corruption. One friar, Brother Peter of Blois, warned that a man who loved his wife too much risked losing favor with God. Why? Because such love was of the world, and to be in the world was to be one step further from heaven. Of course, not everyone agreed. There were softer voices, too. Monks who quietly admitted that joy, even the kind shared between 2 people, could be holy. That affection wasn't always temptation. That love, even in its physical form, might be a small echo of the divine. But those voices were often buried beneath layers of caution, overshadowed by the louder sermons. Still, you can imagine them, those gentle believers, sitting in the back of the chapel, eyes closed, smiling faintly as they listen to hymns about devotion and grace. Not afraid, not ashamed, just human. And maybe that's what you carry with you now as you drift into this memory of a time gone by. That contradiction, that tension between what you're told to feel and what you truly feel, between sin and sincerity, between fear and affection. And you realize that even then, in a world of strict rules and wary glances, people still found ways to love. Quietly, carefully, but they loved. You might imagine that in a world so tightly governed by rules, where even a smile could be suspect, and a kiss between spouses might invite lectures from the pulpit, people would eventually learn to keep their hearts perfectly still. But the truth is, hearts rarely stay still for long. And even in the most obedient corners of medieval life, there were those who couldn't help but stumble, not dramatically, not defiantly, but quietly, softly, sometimes without even realizing it, until the guilt set in. What happens when you break a rule you didn't know existed? You're back in that village again. Perhaps it's winter now. The stones are cold underfoot, and the chapel smells of wax and dust. You go to confession like you're supposed to, kneeling, speaking through a lattice to a priest who barely knows your name, but somehow holds the keys to your soul. And maybe you confess what you think is a minor thing, a thought you had, a dream, a gesture that felt too warm, but the priest doesn't take it lightly. He pauses. He asks follow-up questions. He sighs. And before you know it, you're walking home barefoot, penance assigned shame wrapped around you tighter than your cloak. Confession wasn't just for theft or blasphemy. In the Middle Ages, it became a highly structured process, particularly after the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, when annual confession was mandated for all Christians. From that point forward, even the most private of thoughts could become church business. Priests were trained to ask detailed questions, not to scold, but to root out sin wherever it might hide. Did you touch your spouse with more affection than necessary? Did you experience pleasure during a permitted act? Did you entertain a fantasy even for a moment while lying in bed? There were books to guide this. Penitentials, they were called. Manuals for confessors. They contained long lists of sins and corresponding penances, many of which concerned things that most people today wouldn't consider sinful at all. One such manual from 10th century England advises 7 years of penance for a married couple who engaged in intimacy during a feast day. Another suggests a week of fasting for anyone who kisses their spouse with excessive fondness. Excessive. How much is too much? The books rarely said. Historians still argue whether these punishments were widely enforced, or simply aspirational and ideal for the pious few. Some suggest that these texts were more influential among clergy than common folk. But even if only a fraction of the population followed them literally, the psychological weight was enough to shape how people saw themselves. Take, for instance, the case of a woman in 13th century France who confessed not to any action, but to recurring dreams. In her visions, she was married not to her real husband, but to someone else. The dreams were vivid, filled with colors and laughter, and most scandalous of all joy. She described them in detail, weeping as she spoke. The priest, unsure whether dreams counted as sin, consulted another. Together they decided she must fast for 10 days and recite the penitential psalms barefoot at sunrise. She obeyed, but according to the records, the dreams continued. Or consider a monk in northern Germany who confessed to feelings he couldn't explain. He hadn't acted on them, hadn't even spoken them aloud until that moment, but the weight of carrying them was too great. He was reassigned to another monastery farther inland, colder, quieter, where he was told to reflect and repent. His letters, preserved only in fragments, speak of frost on the windows, and prayers that brought no comfort. And yet not all penances were meant to be cruel. Some were almost poetic in their restraint. A woman in Siena was told to weave a blanket for the poor after confessing that she missed her deceased husband's embrace. The priest wrote that her longing must become warmth for others. And so she did. Thread by thread, she transformed sorrow into charity. Still others were less fortunate. A young man in York confessed to stealing a glance at his neighbor while she bathed. It was wrong, he knew, but he couldn't help it. The priest ordered him to wear a coarse tunic for 6 months and carry a small wooden cross everywhere he went. When someone asked about it, he was to reply, "I watch my eyes." These were the lighter sentences. In harsher regions or under stricter clergy confession could lead to public penance, a procession through town, kneeling at the church door with ashes on your head, whispered rumors that never quite went away. And sometimes the fear of confession kept people silent altogether. One document from a Welsh parish details a woman who avoided Mass for nearly a year because she was too ashamed to confess. When the priest finally confronted her, she collapsed in tears, not because she had done something terrible, but because she had loved someone she wasn't supposed to. He had died. She had never spoken a word of it to anyone. Still, she believed she was guilty. That's the thing about these systems. They weren't always about punishment. They were about conscience, about self-regulation, about teaching people not just to follow rules, but to internalize them to hear a voice, even when no one else was speaking. And you, had you lived then, would likely have done the same. You would have measured your days not just by the sun or the season, but by the weight in your chest. You might have laughed less freely, loved more cautiously, chosen your words with care, not because you feared hellfire, though that was always lurking, but because you feared that someone might find out, or worse, that someone already had. But not everything was bleak. There were glimmers too, moments when confession offered not condemnation but comfort. A monk in Provence once wrote that after he confessed to too much affection for a brother, the abbot didn't punish him. Instead, he assigned him the task of tending the garden. "Plant what brings life," he said. And so he did. He grew herbs, flowers, fruits. He watered the soil each morning and whispered psalms to the vines. It wasn't penance. It was peace. Maybe that's the part worth remembering, that while some confessions were met with shame, others were met with grace. While some rules bruised, others gave structure to fragile lives. While fear was real, so was forgiveness. And for every cruel judgment, there were people who tried quietly, imperfectly to be kind. So if you were to find yourself in that confessional booth centuries ago with your voice trembling and your palms damp, what would you have said? What would you have kept to yourself? Would you have sought mercy, or feared it too much to ask? Perhaps you would have stepped out into the sunlight, eyes squinting, heart pounding, wondering whether the silence that followed was relief, or just the beginning of the next question. And even now, as you rest beneath modern sheets in a quieter century, you might carry something of that silence with you. Not guilt, not shame, but a sense of how deeply people once feared the things they couldn't help feeling, and how gently they tried to make sense of it anyway. And yet, even in places built to suppress temptation, the human heart had other plans. You might think a monastery with its silence, its stone walls, its endless rituals would be the last place for longing to grow. But if anything, it was the perfect soil, quiet, confined, guarded, but never empty. And when you take a mind trained to contemplate and a body trained to deny and place them together in stillness, well, sometimes the things that are supposed to die quietly end up blooming in the dark. Let's walk into one of these cloisters now. The air smells of beeswax and damp linen. There's a garden just off the central hall, not lush, but tidy herbs mostly. You pass monks or nuns with their eyes low fingers, grazing their rosaries. Their faces are plain pale, serious. But look closer. One looks up just a second too long when someone passes. Another seems to clutch her prayer book, a little tighter when she hears a certain voice. These aren't sins. Not yet. But they're the beginnings of something very old and very ordinary. Inside the cloister, the rules were clear. Vows of chastity were absolute. Not just physical abstinence, but purity of thought. And yet records from as early as the 9th century show that infractions, both emotional and physical, were surprisingly common. Church historians have long debated whether this was a failure of monastic discipline or simply evidence that monks and nuns, despite their intentions, remained profoundly human. Some of the most detailed accounts come not from rumor, but from the Church's own investigations. In the 14th century, an abbey in Milan was quietly investigated after rumors spread of nuns going missing for hours during the night. What the bishop's inquiry uncovered was a hidden tunnel, a narrow passage carved beneath the outer wall of the convent, leading not to another sacred site, but to a nearby inn. And there, under the cover of darkness, soft shoes met familiar footsteps. That particular convent wasn't alone. Similar discoveries occurred in Germany, in southern France, and in parts of Spain. Some were passages for smuggling letters or supplies. Others were more personal. One record from a Dominican convent noted that a Brother T had visited a nun A.S. on 17 separate nights. The language in the report is dry clinical, but it ends with the phrase, et ipsa concepit, and she conceived. What happened then? Punishment, yes, but not the kind you might expect. In many cases, pregnant nuns weren't excommunicated or publicly shamed. They were sent away to so-called houses of repentance or charitable hospitals, where they gave birth in silence. The children were often taken to orphanages or left anonymously at church doors. The nuns, if they returned at all, did so with lowered eyes and new names. And what of the monks? Sometimes they were transferred, sometimes defrocked, but just as often they remained perhaps a sermon lighter in the eyes of their abbot, but still walking the same halls, still carrying the same books. Discipline was selective, compassion inconsistent. One particularly poignant case comes from a Cistercian monastery in Burgundy. A novice confessed through tears to having fallen in love with a fellow brother. He hadn't acted on it, but the feelings had consumed him, distracted. His prayers disrupted his fasting, invaded his dreams. The abbot, perhaps recognizing the depth of the boy's turmoil, did not punish him with lashes or exile. Instead, he gave him new duties, working with the infirm. Pour your heart into the healing of others, he wrote. And for a time, the novice did. Historians still argue whether such leniency was rare or simply under-recorded. Many believe that monasteries functioned as miniature societies, some harsh and cold, others unexpectedly gentle. The rules were the same, but their application depended heavily on the personalities in charge. An abbot with a soft heart might spare a penitent. One with a reputation to protect might make an example of them. Still, there's no denying that longing was a constant undercurrent. A 12th century nun named Hildegard of Bingen wrote letters to her spiritual companion Volmar that many scholars now read as emotionally charged, even romantic. She described his voice as a balm, his absence as a bitter silence that grips the soul. Whether their relationship ever crossed a physical line is unknown and ultimately irrelevant. The ache was real, and so was the fear. Because not all stories ended in quiet gardens or reassignments. Some ended with public disgrace. In one monastery near Cologne, a monk was accused of having relations not with another human, but with a local farm animal. The case was documented, investigated, and punished publicly. He was paraded through the town carrying a heavy candle head, shaven feet bare. The point wasn't just to correct the sin, it was to purge the shame from the entire community. But let's return to the quieter stories, the ones that don't make it into public record but live in the margins. The little notes tucked into prayer books, the locks of hair hidden behind altar stones. the embroidered initials stitched beneath robe hems, tiny rebellions, quiet affections, things that could be passed off as devotional if questioned. There's a tenderness to these remnants, a kind of defiant gentleness. They suggest that even in a world bent on suppression, love found a way to speak. Not loudly, not often, but enough. And perhaps that's the most human thing of all, not to reject the rules, but to find space within them, to carve out moments of connection in the cracks, to leave behind no trace but a gesture, a glance, a memory. You might wonder, sitting here centuries later, whether you would have done the same, whether you could have borne the silence, the endless prayers, the constant self-monitoring. And perhaps you could. But somewhere, maybe during morning chants, or while tending the herb garden, you would have met someone's eyes. Just once. Just enough. And maybe you'd have smiled, not with rebellion, not with desire, just with recognition. Because even in stone corridors and candlelit chambers, the human heart kept its rhythm. It would be easy to think that everything in the medieval world fit neatly into categories righteous or sinful, permitted or forbidden, sacred or profane. But that's rarely how life works. And when it came to affection, that didn't follow the expected script, when hearts turned toward people they weren't supposed to. Things became far more complicated, quietly, painfully, and sometimes beautifully. You've left the monastery now, at least in body, but in spirit you remain somewhere in the margins, the places where rules are not spoken, but enforced by glances, silences, and small withdrawals of warmth. In those spaces lived the people whose love did not follow the path the church had lit for them, people who found themselves drawn not to the opposite sex as expected, but to someone who reflected them. And in the Middle Ages, that reflection often led to shadow. The official position of the church on same-sex relationships was harsh, to say the least. From the 6th century onward, penitential manuals treated such acts as grave sins, some punishable by years of penance exclusion from sacraments, or in later periods imprisonment and worse. Theologians like Peter Damian wrote entire treatises, condemning what he saw as the vice of Sodom, calling it a cancer among the clergy. And yet, the stories didn't stop. The feelings didn't stop. The glances still lingered, because rules, no matter how loudly proclaimed, can't always extinguish what quietly stirs in the heart. Take the case of the two nuns in what is now Belgium. Their story survives only through fragments, a confiscated letter here, a disciplinary record there. But pieced together, it tells of something real. They had known each other since novitiate, prayed together, sang side by side in the choir. Over time, their friendship deepened. One gave the other a silver ring plain, but carefully engraved with a Latin phrase, meaning yours in prayer. The other stitched her initials into the hem of the first's robe. Small things, tender things. They took vows of chastity, but not of silence. Eventually, a third sister noticed their closeness and reported them. The Mother Superior, perhaps conflicted, consulted a visiting bishop. His recommendation: separate the women, reassign them to different convents, and burn the ring. The order was followed, but according to one chronicle, the woman who remained wept for many nights and spoke little afterward. The entry ends there. No names, no closure, just grief. But not every story ended in punishment. In a collection of letters from the 14th century now stored in a private archive in France, there are several unsigned correspondences between monks that, while cloaked in theological language, read unmistakably as declarations of affection. One monk writes, "You are the light in my chapel, the echo in my silence." Another ends his letter with a line that could be prayer or poetry: "Let me be where you kneel, even if I cannot speak your name." Historians still debate how to interpret such writings. Were they metaphorical, spiritual? Was it simply the style of the time, heavy with emotion and layered with allegory? Or was it, as some now believe, a coded language of forbidden intimacy, a way for people to express what they could never say aloud? Perhaps the answer is all of the above. After all, language has always been a sanctuary for the unspeakable. There's also the curious case of Richard Rolle, a 14th century English mystic. He wrote about his intense emotional connection with a young woman named Margaret. While most scholars read their relationship as platonic, others point out the vividness of his descriptions, how her presence stilled his soul, how he saw visions of her in prayer, how he feared losing her more than life itself. When she died, young Rolle wrote that his heart broke like ice struck by sun. Was it spiritual love? Romantic? Both doesn't matter. Because what ties all these stories together, whether between men, between women, or wrapped in the cloth of monastic devotion, is the ache of connection in a world that refused to name it. The risk, the longing, and the tiny rebellions that tried to make space for something true, even when no one dared call it love. In some cases, people found ways to live quietly with these feelings. A pair of monks might request reassignment to the same priory. Two women might join the same order in a distant region where no one knew their history. Others weren't so lucky. In England, the Buggery Act of 1533 would later criminalize all forms of male same-sex relations, under civil law introducing legal punishments far more severe than those previously enforced by the Church alone. But in the earlier centuries, before courtrooms and gallows took center stage, punishment was often spiritual: confession, separation, silence, a quiet exile from someone who made the world feel less heavy. And through it all, people found ways to leave traces. A nun's psalter with two initials carved faintly into the back cover. A monk's journal with one passage inked over, though the faded words beneath still show through. A grave in a countryside abbey unmarked but for two small stones placed side by side. Are these just coincidences? Or were they the quiet prayers of people who loved in ways they were told they shouldn't? And now, centuries later, those prayers still whisper, not with rebellion, but with tenderness. A reminder that love has always existed at the edges of rules of rituals of written history. You too would have felt it. The flutter of recognition. The warmth of someone who saw you, not just your role, your vow, your robes, but you. And you would have cherished it, even if you couldn't speak of it, even if it ended in separation. Because in a world that often punished difference, even fleeting affection was a form of quiet courage. And isn't it comforting in a way to know that even in the most repressive centuries, people still found one another, still left notes in the margins, still carved meaning into silence, still loved not in spite of the rules, but through them. So far, we've seen how the heart, even in the strictest corners of medieval life, still found ways to beat. But now let's shift our gaze to another realm of authority, one that spoke with certainty, but was riddled with confusion. You may think of medieval medicine as separate from matters of intimacy, but back then the two were deeply entangled, and unfortunately entangled in all the wrong ways. When you get a headache today, you might reach for aspirin. But in the 12th century, a headache, especially if you were a woman, might be interpreted as a sign of unspent desire, excessive melancholy, or a wandering womb. That's not exaggeration. Medical theories were built on the ancient ideas of Galen and Hippocrates, who believed the human body was ruled by four humours: blood phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. When these were imbalanced, ailments arose, and treatment often came with moral overtones. In medieval Europe, doctors were mostly men, and their understanding of the female body was imaginative, to put it kindly. They wrote earnestly about how excessive moisture in women could lead to hallucinations, melancholy, or spiritual corruption. One prescription suggested that a woman plagued by unclean thoughts should sleep with sliced apples under her pillow, to absorb the dreams and remove temptation. Others involved cold compresses of lettuce leaves, placed on the chest, to cool the humors and reduce desire. Quaint, perhaps, but also deeply revealing of how fear and confusion shaped everyday advice. And this wasn't fringe thinking, it was standard. The Trotula, a widely circulated 12th century medical text written in Salerno and long thought to be authored by a woman physician, though some scholars now debate this, contained detailed recipes for soothing a woman's excessive heat with herbal suppositories made from crushed pearls, rose water, and vinegar. These remedies weren't just about easing discomfort. They were designed to restore moral balance, as if physical longing was a kind of sickness that could be cooled, drained, or purged. And what about men? The medical literature was just as concerned particularly with what they called nocturnal emissions or dreams that resulted in involuntary release. This was seen as dangerous, weakening the body and threatening spiritual clarity. One monk writing in the 13th century recorded a strict regimen to prevent such dreams: fasting before bed, sleeping on stone, and binding the thighs with coarse linen. Another advised sprinkling one's mattress with holy water before sleep. These weren't medical prescriptions as we'd understand them. They were rituals of guilt masquerading as science. Historians still debate where these ideas originated. Some believe they reflect a fusion of classical ideas with Christian morality. Others argue that these prescriptions were less about health and more about control. After all, if you could medicalize morality, if you could label desire as a disease, you could justify almost any intervention. And there were interventions for women accused of being overly affectionate. Physicians sometimes recommended temporary isolation or even bleeding. Yes, the same bloodletting used to treat fevers. A woman too friendly with her male neighbors. Her physician might suggest she avoid music dancing or, ironically, spending too much time in the sun lest it warm the blood. There was an obsession with managing heat, and by extension, passion. Passion, after all, made people unpredictable. It's no surprise, then, that remedies often blurred into superstition. Amulets worn near the hips, potions brewed with crushed gemstones. One particularly strange tidbit comes from a 14th century apothecary manual in southern France, which describes a salve made from bear fat and dried rose petals said to dissolve impure longing. Whether anyone ever actually used it is unknown, but the fact that it was recorded tells you something about the anxieties of the time. But perhaps the strangest part of all is that many of these so-called treatments were based on fear not just of the body, but of what the body could do to the soul. Desire in this worldview wasn't simply a sensation, it was a threat, a crack in the armor of the faithful, something that could unravel years of discipline in a single moment. And yet, even amid the shame and suspicion, people tried to understand themselves. A merchant's wife in Siena wrote in her diary that she felt unclean in her heart after dreaming of her late husband. She asked her confessor if it meant she had sinned. He told her no, but to say 3 Hail Marys and sleep with a crucifix under her pillow just in case. There's a tenderness to her writing, a vulnerability. She wasn't defying the rules. She was trying to live within them, trying to reconcile her feelings with what she'd been taught, trying to be good even when the body didn't always cooperate. And perhaps that's what makes this chapter of history so haunting, not just the absurdity of the treatments or the confusion of the theories, but the earnestness behind them. People truly believed that if they could just find the right herb, the right prayer, the right ritual, they could quiet the restlessness inside. They weren't trying to rebel. They were trying to be whole. You can almost picture it, a young woman placing apple slices beneath her pillow, by candlelight, whispering a prayer she barely understands. A monk binding his legs with linen, convinced it will help him sleep in peace. A physician grinding pearls into dust, believing he's helping someone stay pure. All of it misguided, yes, but not malicious. Just frightened. Just human. And in the end, it's that fear, not the apples, not the salves, that speaks loudest. a fear that desire itself was something dangerous, something to be soothed, silenced, or expelled. But of course it never really worked, because desire, like truth, doesn't vanish, just because we're told it should. It waits, it lingers, it seeps into dreams, and no amount of bear fat or pearl dust can keep it away forever. Now, if you've managed to get through the medicinal madness of crushed pearls, apple slices under your pillow, and spiritual cold compresses without losing your sense of disbelief, then hold on tight, because next we step into a space where the private became painfully public, where intimacy was transformed into a spectacle, and what should have been a tender moment turned into a performance for the sake of law tradition and the unblinking eyes of nobility. Welcome to the medieval consummation ceremony. Yes, consummation. Not just the wedding ceremony with its hymns and blessings and nervous hand-holding, but what came after. The act that turned two individuals into a married couple in the eyes of church and law. And in certain households, particularly the noble ones, that moment didn't always happen behind closed doors. Or rather it did, but not without witnesses. It sounds absurd to modern ears, doesn't it? But for the elite, marriage wasn't just a private union. It was a political contract, a dynastic alliance, a transaction with consequences that could span generations and empires, and so proving that the marriage had been consummated physically unmistakably was more than a formality. It was a requirement. The ceremony varied by region and century, but the core elements were often the same. A symbolic undressing, a public blessing of the bed, and at times the presence of observers. In 15th century France, a newlywed noble couple might be escorted to their chamber by elders of both families, sometimes including a priest or midwife. The couple would be tucked into bed, sometimes even kissed on the forehead by their relatives, and then left to complete the union. In some cases, however, they weren't left entirely alone. A curtain might be drawn, but voices would remain in the room next door. Some chroniclers mention retained servants or chambermaids, tasked with listening for evidence of the act. Others suggest that bed linens were inspected the following morning, for signs of virginity lost. And lest you think this was limited to a single country, think again. In parts of Scandinavia and Germany, the tradition of bedding witnesses continued well into the early modern period. In one 16th century German account, a noble groom attempted to fake the whole thing, splashing wine on the sheets and cutting his own finger to simulate blood. Unfortunately for him, the deception was discovered, and the marriage was annulled on the grounds of fraud. But it wasn't always farce. Sometimes it was humiliation. Imagine you're a noble bride in Castile. You've never met your husband before today. You've just endured hours of solemn Latin ceremony, tight-laced garments, and ritualistic bows before half the kingdom. Now, as you're led to your wedding bed, a group of strangers, elders, advisors, sometimes even jesters, wait in the next room, laughing, drinking, betting on how long the groom will last. You're 17, maybe younger. The pressure to perform was enormous, especially for women. A bride's worth was often measured by her purity, and the consummation ceremony was proof of that purity's end. If the marriage wasn't consummated, it could be annulled. If it was, and the woman conceived her position as wife, and potential queen or duchess was secured. But if it failed, if she bled too much or not enough, or not at all, rumors could spread. Families could be disgraced, alliances could crumble, and so the bodies of young women became stages for diplomacy. In one infamous case, Isabella of Angoulême, who married King John of England in 1200, was barely 12 years old at the time of her wedding. The marriage was politically urgent, and consummation was expected to follow swiftly. Some chroniclers suggest that it did. Others argue that the union was delayed until she matured, but no one disputes that the question of consummation, whether it had occurred when and how, was a subject of public discussion. A child bride thrust into a world where even her most intimate moments were subject to court gossip and legal scrutiny. Historians still argue whether such practices were truly as common as the chronicles suggest, or whether they were sensationalized in retrospect. Some believe that bedding ceremonies were more symbolic than literal, that the act of being led to bed and blessed in front of witnesses was the real performance, and the actual consummation took place later in private. But others, citing legal disputes and preserved trial records, point out that witnesses were often called to testify sometimes decades after the fact about whether a marriage had ever truly been sealed, and where legal proof failed relics were invented. In medieval Poland, one noblewoman's family presented what they claimed were the blood-stained sheets from her wedding night in a court case, 20 years after the event. Whether those sheets were genuine or fabricated is anyone's guess, but they worked. The judge ruled in their favor. Perhaps the strangest thing is how the culture of observation extended beyond just the wedding night. In some households, newlyweds were subjected to bed checks by clergy or family members weeks or even months into their marriage, especially if no pregnancy had resulted. These visits were not always physical inspections, sometimes just probing questions. But the message was clear. Intimacy was not private. It was a public concern. Even commoners weren't entirely spared. In rural parishes, if a couple failed to conceive after several years of marriage, they might be summoned by the local priest for counseling. If one confessed to not enjoying the marital bed, the priest might prescribe a mixture of herbs or offer stern warnings about duty. Yes, even affection was treated as a matter of compliance. And yet, within this suffocating system, people found ways to reclaim moments of tenderness. In a small town outside Paris, a miller and his wife, newly married and visibly nervous, were escorted to their chamber by relatives with drums and laughter. But as the family made merry downstairs, a neighbor crept up to listen at the door. What he heard, instead of fumbling or tension, was soft laughter, a shared joke, the clink of a cup being poured. They weren't rushing. They were being together not for the audience, but for themselves. That moment, undocumented except in one man's diary, lingers. Because not everyone gave in to the performance. Some couples, even in the face of pressure, found quiet rebellion in kindness, a delayed touch, a whispered reassurance, a decision to wait. And if you were one of them, if you had been placed in that room with eyes just beyond the curtain, and expectations breathing down your neck, you might have tried to do the same, to soften the ritual with humanity, to turn a ceremony of judgment into a moment of gentleness, to take your time, or at the very least to hold your partner's hand a little longer before the curtain was drawn. Because behind the pageantry, behind the legal definitions, and the stained sheets was always the same truth, that intimacy, real intimacy, cannot be forced. It must be chosen, even in a world that tried to turn it into law. By now you might be wondering how anyone survived these rules, how anyone ever dared fall in love or reach for someone's hand without fear of punishment, or even dream without shame. But the medieval world had one final lesson to teach, one last unsettling performance where intimacy became not only exposed, but paraded. And this time not in noble chambers or whispered rumors, but on the open streets, with drums, with laughter, with public humiliation. Let's walk for a moment into a small European town, say in 14th century France. The bells ring at midday, and a crowd gathers not for worship, but for something else entirely. A man and a woman, eyes lowered, hands clasped, walk barefoot through the cobbled streets. The woman carries an enormous wax candle. The man wears only a thin tunic, no belt, a symbol of disgrace. They're being punished not for theft or violence or treason, but for breaking the moral codes of the church, for violating rules that reached all the way into the bedroom. Their crime intimacy outside of marriage. And this punishment wasn't uncommon. In fact, in towns across France and Flanders, it became almost theatrical. Offenders would be sentenced to processions through multiple churches carrying penitential candles taller than themselves. They'd be jeered at by neighbors pelted with spoiled fruit or dung and reminded at every step that their private choices were now public shame. Some were forced to kneel at the doors of cathedrals for hours, heads bowed holding signs that detailed their sins. Others had to publicly swear they would never touch their partner in sin again, not even speak to them. It sounds medieval because it was. But more than that, it was meant to be medieval. These public penances weren't just about guilt. They were about theater, about turning moral rules into morality plays where the audience could watch and feel superior. It was a warning, a deterrent, and let's be honest, a bit of scandalous entertainment. In Toulouse, records describe a woman named Marguerite, who was made to walk 3 miles barefoot while being led by a bell ringer. Her offense lying carnally with her betrothed before the banns were fully read. In other words, she and her fiancé were too affectionate before the wedding. They were going to be married anyway. But that didn't matter. The rules were the rules. And sometimes the punishment turned darker. In parts of Germany and the Low Countries, so-called shame masks were used metal masks fashioned into grotesque expressions of lust or foolishness. The accused would be forced to wear them during their penance, becoming walking caricatures of their supposed sin. A woman who spoke too boldly or laughed too freely could be labeled a seductress. A man accused of adultery might be chained to a church door in freezing weather, watched over by townspeople taking turns to spit at his feet. Of course, not all punishment came from the church. Some came from the community itself. In England, charivari rituals took place when the village disapproved of a couple's behavior, usually if they married too young, too old, too soon after a death, or simply seemed too strange. The neighbors would form a procession, banging pots, chanting rude songs, and sometimes dragging effigies of the couple through the streets. It was mockery disguised as morality, laughter turned into control. Historians still argue whether these events were cruel or merely communal corrections. Some suggest they were cathartic, a way for people to express disapproval without resorting to violence. Others point out that shame, once weaponized, rarely stops at its intended target. It spills outward. It lingers. But here's a quieter truth beneath all this noise people still loved. Despite the candles, the masks, the bells, despite the crowds and the punishments and the freezing nights alone, they still loved, sometimes in secret, sometimes at great cost. One couple in Burgundy caught kissing in a vineyard before their wedding day was sentenced to perform a public dance in front of the town square while everyone watched. They did it red-faced and solemn, but years later their daughter wrote in her journal that her parents still danced together every year on that day, not out of shame, but as a kind of soft rebellion, a way to reclaim their moment, to remind themselves that the crowd hadn't won, because while the rules could punish the body, they couldn't always reach the heart. And maybe that's the quiet lesson of it all. That longing endures. That people, ordinary, awkward, brave little people, keep reaching for each other, even when the world tells them not to. They share apples beneath their pillows. They write poems and bury them in walls. They hold hands behind churchyards and pass glances across candlelit tables. They carry their candles, yes, but they also carry each other. And so we gently close the curtain on Europe's medieval past, not because the stories are over, but because it's time to turn the page. To leave behind the cathedrals and cobbled punishments and step into different worlds, other empires, other dreams. Because while Europe was busy building rules out of guilt, other cultures were composing verses of longing, hiding secrets behind silk screens and weaving tenderness into different kinds of traditions. Some were strict, others strangely sweet, but all reveal the same longing, that deep, timeless ache for connection, a yearning that no rule, no mask, no barefoot procession could ever fully silence. Let's follow that thread now. Not through cathedrals, but through palaces, through desert gardens, through distant dynasties where the rules were different, but the heart remained the same. And now, leaving behind the stone streets of Europe, you find yourself drawn toward the glimmering heat of the medieval Middle East, where the rules of intimacy were no less intricate, though often cloaked in poetry law and silence. Here, in the heart of the Abbasid Caliphate, desire lived in shadows, not always hidden, but rarely named. And when it was named, it was done in verse. You're walking now through the golden palaces of Baghdad, sometime in the 9th century. The city pulses with music, scholarship, and trade. It is a hub of science, philosophy, and courtly ritual. But beneath that brilliance lies another world, one not recorded in legal scrolls or religious sermons, but in the delicate ink of forbidden poems. The Abbasid period, especially during its peak under caliphs like Harun al-Rashid and al-Ma'mun, was a paradox of orthodoxy and indulgence. Islamic law rooted in Sharia placed strict boundaries on intimacy outside marriage, and penalties could be severe, especially for adultery. In theory, 4 eyewitnesses were required to convict someone of illicit relations, making it difficult to prove. But the fear of accusation lingered especially for women slaves, or anyone seen as morally suspect. And yet this same society produced some of the most breathtaking love poetry in history. The court poets, the ghazal writers, the mystics and musicians, they all sang of longing, sometimes in vague metaphors, sometimes with heartbreaking clarity. Desire was transformed into symbol, a cup, a rose, a nightingale, a burning sun, and in this language it slipped past censors. A man could write a poem to another man without naming it as love. A woman could whisper her grief without calling it a sin. One Abbasid poet, Abu Nuwas, became infamous for his boldness. His verses celebrated wine passion and same-sex desire, sometimes openly, sometimes with playful disguise. He wrote about the thrill of stolen kisses, the ache of unspoken yearnings, the irony of religious leaders who preached restraint by day and indulged by night. One line from his poem still echoes, "I've never bent my head to shame, only to his chest." It was subversive, of course, but also deeply human. Historians still debate how widely this poetry reflected actual experience. Was Abu Nuwas an outlier, a rebellious artist protected by favor? Or did his verses reveal an underground network of courtiers, scholars and servants who lived double lives, threading between duty and desire? The records are quiet, but occasionally you catch a whisper. A servant girl arrested for sneaking into a scholar's home, not for theft, but for reading a love letter aloud. A young man banished from Basra for composing verses about his tutor's eyes. A caliph who, according to rumor, disguised himself to visit a lover in the outer quarters of the palace. No names, no dates, but the fragments remain, and the contradiction deepened within the court itself. On one hand, strict morality codes were enforced, especially when the eyes of the clerics turned toward public life. On the other, private courts became stages for music, wine, and whispered verses. There were even treatises on etiquette that advised how to pass notes, how to signal consent with subtle hand gestures, or how to reject advances gracefully without causing political embarrassment. It wasn't freedom exactly, but it was a kind of quiet dance, a choreography of closeness that moved within the tight spaces allowed. One lesser-known tidbit involves a woman poet from Kufa named Layla al-Akhyaliya. Though most of her surviving poems are centered on war and tribal politics, a few lines hint at personal longing. Her verses were preserved not because they spoke of love, but because they were clever, wrapped in wit and metaphor. One line, often dismissed as satirical, simply reads, "He drinks from every cup but mine, yet still leaves me thirsty." Historians disagree whether this referred to romantic rejection, poetic rivalry, or political bitterness. But in every interpretation, you can hear the ache of desire just beneath the words. And then, of course, there were the eunuchs, employed in elite households as guardians of women or as bureaucratic servants. Many eunuchs occupied an odd place in Abbasid society. Respected, even powerful, but stripped of recognized sexuality. And yet some became intimate confidants, even lovers. One chronicler describes a eunuch named Tawadud, who wrote passionate letters to his male employer letters that later became teaching texts for Arabic calligraphy. No mention was made of their content, only the elegance of their form. This, perhaps, is the thread that holds everything together, form over confession. You could feel as long as you didn't name it. You could yearn as long as it lived in metaphor. And if you crossed the line, then silence followed, or exile. In modern scholarship, there's ongoing debate over whether these poetic expressions truly challenge the norms, or whether they were tolerated only because they were seen as art, not confession. Did they change the hearts of those who heard them, or simply offer a temporary escape from rules too heavy to bear? You'll never know for sure. But you do know this: the poems remain. Even now, 1,000 years later, they flicker on parchment on lips in classrooms and quiet corners. They whisper of love that dared not speak, but found a way to sing. And just like that, the candle of the Abbasid court dims. But don't look away, because in a land even farther east, behind embroidered screens and within jade-colored palaces, another kind of silence ruled. One not of poetry, but of obedience. Where love poems weren't just scandalous, they were enough to ruin a family's honor. Let's drift now through a curtain of embroidered silk into a world where words were measured not just for what they meant, but for what they implied. You are in the court of Joseon-era Korea, a dynasty that ruled the Korean peninsula from 1392 to 1897. And here love was not written in verses of longing, or shouted in the streets. It was hidden beneath layers of etiquette, protocol, and silence. Love in Joseon was a whisper behind a fan, a brushstroke in the margin, a scandal waiting to happen. You're walking through a noblewoman's quarters. Quiet, lacquered wood, low beams, clean rice paper walls. The only sound is the gentle sweep of her sleeve as she kneels beside a writing table. On the paper before her, she pens a single verse. A poem not for publication, not for sharing. Just a few lines of longing for her husband, who has been posted far away in a regional magistrate's office. But that verse will never reach him. It will be discovered by a family servant, handed to an elder relative, and presented to the local governor as evidence of her impropriety. Because in Joseon, Korea, to be in love, at least to admit it, could be seen as disorder, a deviation from the expected order of Confucian conduct. This was a society deeply shaped by Neo-Confucianism, a philosophical framework imported from China that governed every aspect of daily life, from the hierarchy between ruler and subject to that between husband and wife. Harmony was everything. Balance, restraint, duty. And at the center of that harmony stood the family, not as a private unit of affection, but as the building block of the state. And so emotions, especially romantic ones, were to be regulated, contained. Married couples were expected to care for one another, of course, but to show it too openly, to write poems or send tokens or speak of yearning, that was seen as undermining dignity, a sign of weakness. And in the case of noble families, even a threat to their honor. One famous case involved a Yangban aristocrat named Seo Jung-won, whose wife composed a poem for him after he was stationed in a remote province. The verse was beautiful, spare, full of aching grace. She sent it with a trusted servant. But somehow it fell into the hands of a rival family, and was used to argue that Seo's household was ruled by passion, not reason. As punishment, he was demoted, and his wife was confined to her quarters for a year. Her poem, It Survives. A single line still resonates today. Your shadow crosses my wall, though you are 100 miles away. Historians have debated this event endlessly. Was the punishment truly about the poem, Or was it political maneuvering disguised as moral correction? Either way, the message was clear: feelings were not to be broadcast, especially not by women, and never ever without permission. This suppression didn't mean emotions didn't exist. On the contrary, they often burst forth in unexpected ways. Some women kept secret journals, filling them with stories of heartbreak and hope. One young noblewoman wrote in her pillow book, "I saw him in the courtyard and felt a joy I did not understand. I prayed for winter to last longer so I might glimpse him through the snow." She never named the man, but the passage reveals the quiet boldness of her heart. For men, the rules were no less rigid, though slightly more forgiving. A husband could write poetry for his wife, but it was expected to be formal, restrained, and reflective of virtue, not desire. One official, Yi Guangyu, was censured for composing a love letter in which he praised his wife's singing voice. The letter was discovered by his superior and declared an inappropriate display of softness. He was docked 3 months' salary and required to write a letter of apology to the Ministry of Rights. There's something almost absurd about it, isn't there? A society where being too affectionate could lose you your job. But that was the point. The Confucian ideal wasn't about romance, it was about hierarchy. A good marriage was one of structure, not sentiment. The wife served the husband served the state, and feelings complicated that neat chain of duty. And yet people still loved. There's a lesser-known tidbit about a young scholar named Park Jin, who, unable to speak freely to the woman he loved, took to planting bamboo shoots outside her home. Each stalk, he explained in a later memoir, represented a line of a poem he dared not write. The woman never acknowledged them, but when Park died, she visited his grave and left a single slip of paper beneath a stone. The words have never been recovered, but her presence there, quiet, deliberate, was its own kind of verse. Even court records, though dry and formal, sometimes hint at deeper stories. One entry from 1684 notes that a nobleman was found guilty of excessive letter writing to a widowed court lady. His letters contained no vulgarity, no proposal, just long reflections on the stars, the seasons, and the nature of longing. His punishment was banishment to the countryside. But before he left, he was allowed to visit the palace one last time. The court lady, who had never replied to his letters, was seen leaving a single chrysanthemum on the stone path he would take out of the city. A flower and nothing more, but enough. Historians still argue about how common such affections were and how often they were punished. Some insist these were rare exceptions, anomalies, in an otherwise rigid society. Others suggest that beneath the strict Confucian order, a vibrant emotional life endured. Hidden, yes, but persistent. And maybe that's why these small gestures, poems, bamboo shoots, chrysanthemums feel so powerful. Because they are acts of quiet resistance, of human desire threading its way through tight seams. And beyond the nobility among the commoners, the rules were slightly looser, but no less complicated. Folk songs preserved from the period speak of lovers separated by class duty or war. They describe secret meetings at night markets, hands brushing beneath lantern light, promises whispered by rivers. One song from the southern province of Jeolla describes a girl who leaves red silk on her windowsill each time she dreams of her love. Another tells of a fisherman who carves his beloved's name into his oar so he never forgets her face. These songs weren't political. They weren't even always written down. But they tell you something important, that even in a world shaped by silence, people found ways to speak. And perhaps the most surprising voices came not from the living, but the dead. In the burial grounds of the Joseon elite, archaeologists have found tomb inscriptions that break the mold of stoic formality. One tomb belonging to a minor official, and his wife reads, "I never spoke the words, but I hope you felt them. May we meet again under kinder stars." Another, more faded, contains only a single character, Sarang, love. not duty, not loyalty, not honor, just love. It's enough to make you wonder how many feelings were never spoken, never written, but still endured. How many verses were destroyed, how many gestures left unrecorded, how many glances passed across palace courtyards without a single soul ever knowing. And in the end, that may be the real legacy of love in Joseon Korea. Not the punishments, not the censorship, but the quiet resilience of affection, soft enduring and endlessly creative. So as you step away from the pine-scented courtyards and white-tiled rooftops of the Joseon dynasty, you carry with you a sense of bittersweet beauty, of feelings buried beneath etiquette, of poems never sent, of flowers left behind. And now let's follow that trail of tenderness onward, toward a land older still where intimacy was shaped not by Confucian ideals, but by power, ownership, and sometimes heartbreak carved into stone. Now, as the pine winds of Korea fade behind you, the air begins to warm. Dust rises beneath your feet, golden and dry, and soon you find yourself walking along a winding path toward the walls of ancient Thebes. It is Egypt long before the empire of Cleopatra, long before Roman conquest, an Egypt ruled not by pharaohs alone, but by gods and rituals, and the silent labor of thousands who built a city in stone and silence. And here love, power, and propriety played out in a different way, still bound by rules, but these rules were etched more in labor and class than in written law. You're standing now before the village of Deir el Medina. It's a quiet, sun-baked place tucked into the western desert, near the Valley of the Kings. This was no ordinary village. It housed the artisans, scribes, and workers who carved the royal tombs into the cliffs. They were literate, organized, and surprisingly well documented. And though their job was to create eternal resting places for pharaohs their own lives, small, emotional Messi left just as many echoes. Here you meet a woman named Nephiset. She's a servant in a scribe's household, not enslaved but not free either, bound by dependency. She draws water from the well, grinds flour, tends to children, and one day she falls in love with someone she shouldn't, a temple guard named Pa Amenemhat. He's older, slightly higher in status, and sworn to celibacy while on temple duty. Their meetings are brief. A glance at the market, a whispered joke in the alley, a scrap of linen with a tiny lotus flower drawn in ink. But love doesn't always wait for permission. According to a fragmentary ostrakon, a pottery shard used as scrap paper. Nephiset confessed to her mistress that her heart was confused by longing, and that she had spoken too freely to the man who holds the temple key. It sounds innocent enough, but the consequences were anything but. Within days she was dismissed from the household, not publicly punished, but quietly cast out. No records mention where she went, but her name disappears from village rosters soon after. This is what desire looked like here, delicate, dangerous, and often unspeakable. The rules of intimacy in ancient Egypt were both stricter and looser than you might imagine. Among the elite, marriage contracts were formal, recorded, and often deeply transactional, outlining not just dowries but the right to property, expectations for fidelity, and even clauses for divorce. Among commoners, marriage was more casual, based on cohabitation and shared responsibility. But in either case, the idea of romantic affection was secondary. What mattered more was lineage stability and social role. And for women like Nephiset, poor, dependent, and unprotected desire was more liability than luxury. Still, love managed to survive. On tomb walls, couples are sometimes depicted hand in hand, equal in size and artistic choice that suggests tenderness. In letters, we find lovers calling one another, my sister and my brother, not in the familial sense, but as a poetic gesture of intimacy. One particularly touching papyrus features a man writing to his beloved, I will go down to the river, and if I do not see your face, the water will not quench my thirst. But even this sentiment had its boundaries. Among temple staff, especially those sworn to serve specific gods, any form of desire was seen as disruption. Priests and gods were often expected to live in ritual purity, avoiding not just intimate acts but even contact with certain women during holy periods. Breaking this code could result in expulsion or worse accusations of defiling the sacred space. That was likely the risk Nephiset and Pa Amenemhat took. Not just scandal, but sacrilege. Historians still debate how literal these rules were. Did every priest truly abstain? Were gods expected to police their hearts as well as the temple gates? Or were such expectations more aspirational than enforceable? Some records suggest quiet tolerance. Others show swift judgment. The truth, as usual, lives somewhere between. And then there's the strange case of a man named Ramos, an artisan, whose tomb was uncovered in the 1920s with unusual inscriptions. Alongside the typical prayers and lineage records, his walls included verses of longing, not for a wife or concubine, but for a fellow craftsman, named Ka'emwaset. The inscriptions use language typical of romantic texts, words like beloved heart companion and life twin, but no formal relationship is described. Some scholars argue these were metaphors of brotherhood. Others suggest a deeper bond unspoken, yet inscribed in stone. Either way, it tells you something powerful, that affection in this world could cross lines of class, of gender, of propriety, but always quietly, always at risk. There's also a lesser-known tidbit involving love charms. Among poorer Egyptians, especially women with few legal protections, small rituals were used to try to secure affection, or at least attention. One charm involved whispering a man's name into a hollow reed and floating it down the Nile. Another instructed the woman to place a small scarab figurine under her mattress, carved with the phrase, "May he look at me as Ra looks at the dawn." Were they effective? Doubtful. But they offered something just as powerful: hope. Because in this society where everything land, labor, fertility was tied to power, intimacy became a kind of rebellion. Not through bold declarations or public protests, but through the quiet insistence that one's heart mattered. That longing deserved a voice. And sometimes even the pharaohs broke the rules. One record from the New Kingdom tells of a royal concubine who was discovered writing her own poetry, not under her birth name, but a pseudonym. Her verses described the loneliness of waiting for the king's attention, the emptiness of silks without his touch, the bitterness of being replaced. She was not punished. Instead, she was moved to a quieter part of the harem, and her name, real or imagined, was scratched out from future records. Her poem ends with a single searing line: "I gave him my youth. He gave me a room with no door." Historians argue about her identity. Was she real? Was she a composite? But the poem exists, and so does the ache behind it. This is the rhythm of intimacy in ancient Egypt, rules whispered by power feelings written in code and consequences that often fell hardest on the most vulnerable. And yet people still reached for one another, through poetry, through charms, through glances and gestures and inscriptions in hidden places. Even the burial practices hint at this. In some tombs, couples are buried side by side with inscriptions not just of their lineage, but of their shared life. One tomb in Saqqara includes a line rarely seen elsewhere: "May your spirit walk beside mine in every season. May the gods never separate our hearts." That's not just formality. That's devotion. So as you leave the sun-scorched stone of Thebes behind, as you walk once more through shifting sand and time, you carry with you the memory of those who dared to love in a world that didn't always allow it. Next, we move west again, this time to the cloisters and courtyards of Catholic Spain, where discipline was the watchword, but longing lingered between the lines of sacred vows. Now your footsteps echo softly across cool stone floors, and the sun that once beat upon you in Egypt is replaced by the diffused glow of candlelight. You've arrived in Spain specifically in the devout silence of a 17th century convent. The air here carries the scent of wax and parchment, and every sound is muffled by thick walls meant to keep the world out. This is a place of discipline, cloistered life, and holy obedience. But like all places where rules tighten around the body, the heart finds its own quiet defiance. You're in the city of Burgos, and outside these walls the Spanish Empire is straining beneath its own grandeur. The Inquisition still looms, monarchs come and go, and the Catholic Church governs not only salvation, but also emotion education and memory. But inside this convent, in one particular small box, tucked deep into an archive, lies a story few were meant to see. It's not grand. It's not even a scandal in the traditional sense, but it is very human. That wooden box, no bigger than a bread loaf, was discovered during a restoration of a convent storeroom in the early 1900s. Inside, scholars found 23 silver rings, wrapped individually in scraps of linen and parchment. Each one bore initials, dates, and most surprisingly short phrases that hinted at bonds between the women who once wore them. Phrases like, "Eternally yours under the veil," or "You are the breath in my prayer." The rings, it seemed, had been exchanged between nuns over the span of several decades, tokens of affection, possibly even declarations of spiritual partnership. While some were anonymous, others bore names later confirmed in convent rosters. The discovery shocked the historians who found it, not because it suggested romantic scandal, but because it revealed a side of monastic life that had long been overlooked, the deep emotional attachments that flourished in places built to suppress them. Of course, convents in early modern Spain were not just centers of faith. They were institutions shaped by politics, wealth, and necessity. For many noble families, sending a daughter to a convent was not so much a spiritual calling as a social strategy. It preserved family property by keeping dowries small, avoided the dangers of marriage alliances gone wrong, and cloaked unmarried daughters in the prestige of piety. Some young women entered willingly. Others were pressured. Some found meaning. Others found loneliness. But all of them found each other. Within these walls, bonds were forged not just in shared routines and rituals, but in whispered conversations after evening prayer, in letters passed through servants and small gifts hidden in sewing baskets or prayer books. And while the Church officially recognized only divine love and sisterly charity, the line between sacred affection and human yearning could sometimes blur. One such example comes from the letters of Sister Clara de Santa Ana, a cloistered nun in Toledo, who wrote extensively to another nun, Sister Inés del Corazón. Though their letters were never intended for public eyes, a few have survived in private collections. In them, Clara writes, "Your absence turns the chapel colder. I speak your name silently before each hymn." Inés in return wrote, "I see your face in the host. I feel your soul beside mine in the silence." Were these simply expressions of spiritual sisterhood? Possibly. But they speak with a tenderness that suggests something more, a companionship that defied the solitude demanded by their vows. Historians continue to debate how to interpret these relationships. Some argue that they were purely spiritual, shaped by the mystical traditions of Catholic devotion. Others point to the emotional intensity, the coded language, and the physical tokens exchanged as evidence of deeper, more complex bonds. But in either case, they reveal a truth that no rulebook can erase. Humans seek connection, even in silence, even under vows, and sometimes those connections were punished. In 1624, a nun in the city of Zamora was brought before a church tribunal for excessive familiarity with another sister. The charges were vague, the witnesses few, but the accusation alone was enough to stain reputations. Both women were separated, placed in different convents, and forbidden from corresponding again. The tribunal records are careful not to name the nature of the relationship, only that it was inappropriate in tone and frequency. And yet in the margins of one document, a scribe had written a note perhaps in sympathy. They prayed with one voice. Still, not all bonds were suspect. Many convents encouraged deep spiritual friendships, especially among novices and their mentors. These relationships were seen as vital to moral instruction and emotional stability, but when those friendships grew too exclusive or too expressive, they risked scrutiny. One tidbit from a Carmelite convent in Seville stands out. A novice named Isabel carved a tiny heart into the wood of her writing desk and filled it with a mixture of beeswax and dried petals. Beneath it she wrote, "I vow to love you as Christ loves his church." The object was discovered decades later during repairs. No disciplinary record exists. No names survive but hers. And yet the tiny heart remains testament to devotion that tried to walk the line between sacred and human. It's worth noting that not all convent affection was romantic or controversial. Some of it was deeply practical. In a world where women had little legal autonomy and few avenues for education, convents offered something rare: access to books, time to write, and a network of mutual care. Nuns managed finances, taught girls, transcribed theological texts, and even composed music. In these roles, collaboration and emotional bonds were not only natural, but necessary. But when those bonds threatened the church's hierarchy, or hinted at desires that couldn't be neatly categorized, they became dangerous. One of the most famous cases of such tension involved Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, a Mexican nun of Spanish descent who lived in the 17th century. Though not Spanish by residence, her letters circulated widely in Spanish convents and caused waves. She wrote openly of her love for the viceroy's wife, calling her Lisi, and addressing her in verse with lines like, "I adore you with my soul, though heaven tells me I should not." Though Sor Juana was never formally punished for these writings, she was pressured to renounce her intellectual pursuits later in life, and died in relative silence. Her story became both cautionary and legendary. Even today, her verses appear in anthologies of religious poetry, but often without context. So what does all this tell you? That behind the walls of Spain's holy sanctuaries, there pulsed a quieter, softer defiance. A belief that affection, however forbidden, could still be sacred. That longing could coexist with liturgy. That love didn't always need permission to exist. Historians still argue over the nature of these bonds. Were they spiritual friendships, romantic entanglements, emotional dependencies born of confinement? There is no single answer. But perhaps the point isn't what label they deserve, but what they reveal. That even in the most controlled environments, humanity flowers. And sometimes it does so in silver rings wrapped in linen. As you leave the cool hush of the cloisters behind you, might imagine one last candle flickering beside a bunk, one last note hidden in a prayer book, one last glance exchanged during evening vespers. Not loud, not lasting, but real. And from here we travel farther east into the heat and shadows of medieval India, where the veil was both protection and prison, and where even a glimpse could set fire to a reputation. Now the stone corridors and whispered prayers of Spain fade behind you, like the last notes of a hymn. The sun grows sharper again, brighter. The scent of rose and turmeric fills the air, and the earth beneath your feet turns red and warm. You're in Rajasthan now, once the domain of the Rajput kings, those fierce warrior rulers, whose kingdoms were bound as much by honor as by sword. And here in this land of ornate palaces, glittering jewels and ancient codes of conduct intimacy, wasn't just regulated. It was watched, hidden, judged, and sometimes destroyed before it ever took form. This is a world of purdah, the practice of female seclusion, where noble women were kept behind veils, latticed windows, or entire palace wings. Their faces might never be seen by anyone outside their immediate family. Their names might never be spoken in public. To exist was to remain invisible. To love or be suspected of love was a gamble few could afford. You arrive at a courtyard in the fort of Jodhpur, where the sun glints off yellow sandstone and silk curtains flutter behind carved jericas. Those balcony windows that looked out at the world without allowing the world to look back. It's here that a young duchess once lived. Her name mostly lost to time. Some say it was Rani Devanshi. Others suggest it was only a title, Mehfil ki Rani, the queen of the assembly. But all the legends agree on one thing: she broke the code. According to a royal diary fragment preserved in Mehrangarh Fort, the duchess once looked too long through the jaraka during a spring festival. A visiting nobleman from a distant kingdom, unaware of local custom, raised his eyes and met hers just for a moment. That was all. No touch, no letter, just a glance. But that glance set whispers in motion. The Rajput code of honor known as Maryada was unyielding. A woman's virtue was tied to the reputation of her entire family, and even the perception of impropriety could ruin alliances, tarnish legacies, or trigger retaliation. For royal women especially, these expectations were suffocating. Soon after the incident, the Duchess stopped appearing at court gatherings. Her attendants were reassigned, and months later, a funeral procession was held in silence. No cause of death was officially recorded, but in private tales passed down among palace maids and temple dancers, a single explanation is whispered. She chose to immolate herself to preserve her family's name from disgrace. The practice known as sati was not uncommon in certain Rajput communities, though by the 17th century it was beginning to face opposition. Most instances of sati followed a husband's death, not a scandal. But there were stories like this one, where the act became not just a ritual, but a message better to burn than to shame. Historians debate whether this story is true or merely an amplified cautionary tale. Some records suggest the woman lived, and was simply exiled to a remote palace. Others insist the tale was invented to warn other noblewomen against even the smallest slip. But real or not, the story endures, because it speaks to a system where love wasn't just forbidden, it was feared. Still, desire doesn't vanish behind a veil. Even within these restrictions, women found ways to express longing. They wrote poetry, ghazals, and doha, some of which survive in family collections. One poem attributed to a Rajput princess and recorded anonymously in the 18th century reads, "The moonlight touches your turban. I touch the screen and pretend not to see. The gods gave me a window, not a voice. So I write this in the folds of my sari. It's both aching and defiant, and it hints at how carefully love had to be folded into daily life." Among royal households, servants often acted as go-betweens. Maids carried messages tucked in embroidery threads. Musicians sang verses with hidden meanings during evening recitals. Even the placement of a flower in a woman's braid could signal longing or resistance. But the risks were real. One documented case from 1750 tells of a courtesan named Sitara, who had once served as a dancer in a noble court, and later became the personal attendant to a young princess. The two grew too close for the comfort of the court. When rumors spread that Sitara had taught the princess not just music, but independent thought, she was dismissed, accused of subverting the girl's modesty. Sitara's fate after that is unknown, but in the princess's embroidery, sampler preserved in a museum in Jaipur, a single red thread forms the shape of a lotus opening toward the sun. Some interpret it as a tribute, others merely a flower. Even outside royal circles, rules of conduct were rigid. In Rajput communities, arranged marriage was the norm. Romantic choice was rare. A girl's marriage was often negotiated when she was still a child, sometimes before birth. And though some women grew to love their husbands, or at least respect them, many lived entire lives having never spoken freely to the man they shared a bed with. Still, human creativity endured. Among Rajput folk traditions, one curious tidbit survives: the art of mirror writing. Women forbidden from writing openly would sometimes etch poetry backward into metal mirrors with hairpins. To read it, you had to hold it to the light and tilt your head just so. Many of these messages were never discovered during the women's lifetimes, but were later found hidden inside dowry trunks or behind painted screens. One message, barely visible now, reads, "I see him only in shadows, but my shadow longs for him." There's also the curious case of Mahandi, the intricate henna designs painted on hands and feet for weddings. Some brides use this art to sneak in secret initials or symbols, sometimes not their husbands. One preserved pattern includes the letter K, hidden beneath a peacock's feather on the bride's palm. When asked, she claimed it stood for Kama, the god of love. But family records show that the groom's name started with a different letter entirely. Historians still argue whether these were deliberate messages or mere coincidence. But the layering of love beneath tradition is unmistakable. Over time, resistance grew. By the late 19th century, reform movements in India began challenging purdah and advocating for women's education. Some Rajput women began publishing under pseudonyms, speaking not just of national freedom, but emotional freedom. Letters survive from a woman named Rukmini Devi, who wrote, "I may not walk the streets, but my words will." Yet even today, echoes of these restrictions remain in some communities. The battle between honor and autonomy continues not just in grand gestures, but in the quiet negotiations of everyday life. And what can we take from all this? That in Rajput India the veil was more than cloth. It was metaphor. It was barrier. It was burden. And for many women it was also the canvas upon which they painted their longings, carefully, cautiously, beautifully. Even in silence, love had a way of speaking. And now, as the desert wind carries your thoughts eastward, we arrive in Byzantium, where gold shimmered on palace walls and scandal glittered almost as brightly as the mosaics. There in the land between two continents, one woman shattered every rule she was handed and changed history in the process. Now the red dust of Rajasthan falls away behind you, and with it, the weight of veils and shadows. In their place rises the sea-washed gleam of a city suspended between two continents, two faiths, 2 centuries. You've arrived in Byzantium, Constantinople, as it was known in the height of its splendor. Gold mosaics shimmer on church domes. Marble columns reflect the afternoon light. And 1,000 candles flicker beneath frescoed ceilings in the Hagia Sophia. The rules here are no less strict than in the places you've visited, but they wear a different robe. Here purity is tied not to honor alone, but to empire, spectacle, and power. And here one woman defied it all. Her name was Theodora. And if you had met her when she was a girl, you never would have guessed her fate. Born sometime around 500 CE, Theodora's early life was far from noble. Her father was a bear trainer in the Hippodrome, that grand circus arena, where chariot races and public performances filled the air with cheers and curses. When he died, Theodora's mother, desperate to feed her daughters, reportedly pushed Theodora into performing too. Some sources, like the historian Procopius, claim she was an actress, a word that in Byzantium often implied far more than stagecraft. Women who danced or performed in public were automatically branded as morally suspect, and if they engaged in bawdy or comedic acts, the church considered them impure outside the realm of respectable womanhood. According to Procopius, Theodora wasn't just an actress, but a courtesan participating in shows that scandalized the city's elite. One famous anecdote, likely exaggerated, describes her performing pantomime skits, in which she stripped piece by piece, tossing grapes to the crowd from parts of her body rarely mentioned in polite company. Whether true or simply character assassination, these stories were later used to emphasize just how far she rose. Because rise she did. She caught the eye of Justinian, nephew to the emperor, and eventual heir to the throne. But Byzantine law forbade imperial officials from marrying actresses, an ancient regulation meant to protect the purity of the ruling class. A woman like Theodora was seen as unclean, disruptive, and far too familiar with the desires of men. But Justinian, to his credit, or folly depending on whom you ask, changed the law. He had it struck down, and he married her. Historians still debate whether this was an act of romance or shrewd calculation. Justinian saw in Theodora not just beauty, but cunning charisma and political insight. Together they ruled not just as emperor and empress, but as true partners. And here's where the rules truly began to unravel. Theodora, once shamed for her body, now dictated the moral code of the empire. She pushed for legislation protecting women from forced prostitution. She established safe houses for vulnerable girls. She introduced laws granting women property rights and limiting abusive husbands' power to disinherit their wives. In a world where laws had long silenced women, she bent those laws into something almost resembling protection. There's even a record of her personally intervening in a case where an official was accused of coercing young women into court service perhaps too reminiscent of her own past. She had him tried, stripped of his office and exiled. And yet, even as she reformed the empire, her past clung to her like perfume on silk. Procopius, in his infamous Secret History, paints Theodora as a monster in pearls, lascivious, vengeful, power-hungry. He writes that she once declared she regretted she didn't have more bodily orifices to entertain her lovers. It's lurid, sexist, and likely fictional, but it shaped how Theodora was remembered for centuries as a woman who had once been too much and became something even more dangerous, respected. The church struggled to accept her. So did many in the court. But the people, especially women and the poor, adored her. Her face appeared in mosaics beside Justinian's, in the Basilica of San Vitale in Ravenna. Her gaze steady, her robes resplendent with gold. She wasn't hidden or minimized. She was central. Still, her reign wasn't free from cruelty. She could be ruthless in politics, especially toward those who questioned her right to rule. She orchestrated the downfall of generals, the exile of bishops, and even the death of a noblewoman rumored to have slighted her. The same passion that drove her reforms sometimes turned to ice in the face of dissent. But perhaps the most haunting moment came during the Nika riots of 532, a massive uprising that nearly toppled Justinian's rule. The city burned, senators fled, and Justinian considered escape. It was Theodora who, according to chroniclers, gave the famous speech, "Purple is a good color for a shroud." She refused to flee. She stood her ground, and her resolve turned the tide. It's hard to know which parts of her story are fact, and which were twisted by those who either adored or despised her. But one detail, quiet small, remains largely unchallenged. At court banquets, Theodora reportedly insisted that dancers and actresses not be mocked or excluded from feast offerings. She remembered, always. She didn't erase the parts of herself that others wanted forgotten. She made them law. Historians still argue whether Theodora was a feminist before her time, a power-hungry queen, or both. Some see her as a tragic example of how women must overperform to survive in male-dominated power structures. Others celebrate her as a symbol of resilience, someone who refused to be defined by the shame imposed upon her. But no matter which version you believe, one truth remains: she rewrote the rules about womanhood, about desire, about power, and that rewriting left its mark. In later centuries, Byzantine empresses would refer back to Theodora when asserting their influence. Her name became a weapon and a shield. In cloistered convents, her mosaic image was sometimes whispered about with awe and curiosity, especially by women who longed for more than silence. There's even a curious tidbit preserved in the diary of a Venetian traveler who visited Constantinople in the 12th century. He wrote of seeing a locket sold in the market, shaped like an open palm with an inscription, "She held her fate like gold." It was said to be a charm invoking Theodora's strength, not her sin. And now, as the waters of the Bosphorus shimmer below, you feel the weight of every step you've taken through convents and palaces, past prayer books, and hidden windows from whispered poems to shouted decrees. You've walked through centuries of rules, all meant to restrain the heart, the body the voice. But the heart, as you've seen, often speaks anyway. And in the final hush of this journey, we return to where we began. Not to rules, but to what survives them. The small, quiet moments left behind like fingerprints on stone. A grave, a ring, a line of poetry, a name carved beside another. Because long after the codes were written, what remains is longing and love. You walk slower now. The sun has dipped, casting long shadows across the road behind you. The path you've taken through centuries of whispered rules, unspoken shame, punished longing, and stubborn resilience. From medieval Europe to the golden courts of the Abbasids, from veiled palaces in India to the candlelit chapels of Spain, and finally to Byzantium's glittering defiance, you've seen it all. And now, with the hush of twilight wrapping around your shoulders like a cloak, we turn towards something gentler. Not another kingdom, not another scandal, but something more enduring. What remains when the rules fade? You arrive in a village in southern France, nestled against the foothills of the Pyrenees. The air is cool and damp. Olive trees sway gently in the evening breeze, and old stone paths curve between lavender fields and tiny chapels. It's a quiet place, the kind of village people forget to write about. But here on the edge of time is a grave that tells a story no law could silence. The tombstone is modest, worn by centuries of rain and moss. But beneath the softened carvings, you can still make out two names etched carefully into the limestone, one atop the other, not as parent and child, not as husband and wife, just two names paired, no dates, no family crest, no church symbol, but something unmistakably tender in the way they rest joined. Local lore says they were two women lifelong companions buried side by side. Some say they were cousins. Others claim they were cloistered nuns who defied their vows of solitude. A few whisper that they were just friends inseparable to the very end. No one knows for certain. But the fact that their grave remains undisturbed, uncorrected, unhidden, speaks volumes. It was carved in the 14th century, a time when the church still punished nonconformity with fire exile or silence. Yet someone somehow allowed this tribute to love to remain. And that is where our journey lands. Because after all the bans and penances, after the public shame and secret rituals, what survives is not the punishment, but the love beneath it. Quiet, fragile, persistent. For centuries, most people weren't allowed to choose who they loved. Rules governed everything when, how, and whether one could express affection. The church declared over 100 days a year unfit for intimacy. Royal families summoned witnesses to their wedding beds. Confessions were made for dreams, not deeds. Monasteries hid secret vows between nuns. Palaces burned with rumors of love across caste and class lines. Women were punished for poems, for glances, for the shape of their feelings. And yet, across all these centuries and empires, love still happened. It happened in shadowed hallways and on stitched pillowcases, in poems etched backward on mirrors, in forbidden rings exchanged inside prayer books, in the silk hem of a bridal mehendi pattern, and in the steely gaze of a former actress who became an empress, in grief, in bravery, in silence. It happened because desire is not just rebellion, it is human. One mainstream historical fact that endures across all these cultures is that people have always found ways to love, even when laws tried to cage them. Historians still argue whether certain acts of resistance, like writing anonymous love poems or secretly exchanging rings, were conscious rebellion or quiet survival. But does it matter? The results are the same proof of hearts still beating under constraint. There's even a tidbit from 17th century Ireland, where a woman named Mary Bowie was said to have buried her lover's ring beneath a hawthorn tree, believing that its roots would grow around the memory, keeping it safe. When the land was later tilled, the tree stood untouched, encircled by wild roses. And that's the thing about love, real love. It makes its own space. Today we often take that space for granted. In many places we are free to choose who we marry when we speak, what we write, who we miss. But those freedoms are very new and very fragile. Remember, it wasn't long ago that people were punished for looking at the wrong person, or loving the wrong way, or wanting it all. So what survives? Not the names of every lawmaker who declared intimacy shameful, not every sermon that branded longing as sin, not every scandalous decree that reduced love to transaction. What survives is the writing on mirrors, the initials in the mehandi, the names etched together on a tombstone no one dared to separate. What survives are the small acts of quiet defiance, performed not with swords but with softness. You might not remember the name of the duchess who burned herself to protect her family's name, but you might remember the poem she left behind. You might not recall the exact words of every church band, but you'll remember that a pair of nuns exchanged silver rings and called it holy. And that matters, because tonight, as you settle into the stillness of your room and prepare for rest, maybe your heart aches a little less. Maybe you feel a little more grateful that you live in a time when love, while still messy, still complicated, is not always punished, that you can reach out, speak, choose, dream, that you are allowed to long. And for all those who came before you, who whispered their feelings into cracks in stone, or sewed them into hems, they made this moment possible, not by grand gestures, but by enduring. So breathe deeply. Let the weight of history drift from your shoulders. Let the candles dim. Let the echoes quiet. You've walked through centuries tonight, not just of rules, but of resistance, of heart. And if you listen closely beneath the hush of the past, you can still hear it beating. So now, as the final candle flickers and the world hushes into soft sleep, you rest beneath the blanket of stories that have spanned 1,000 years. You've walked beside queens and kitchen maids, abbesses and actresses across hushed monasteries, bustling courts and silent gardens where only longing dared speak. You've seen the rules, yes, the rigid, the cruel, the absurd. But you've also seen what outlasts them, the glances that became lifelines, the verses passed in secret, the names side by side carved into stone. And maybe you understand now that tenderness is stronger than tyranny, that even in centuries where the heart was punished, it still found ways to sing. A whispered line of poetry, a hidden ring, a shared dream. So close your eyes gently now. The road behind you is long, but it brought you here safe, warm, and wiser. Let the sorrow soften into gratitude. Let the curiosity settle into comfort. Let the faces you met tonight, some real, some lost to legend, stay with you like fireflies at the edge of a field. They loved, they longed, they survived, and now so do you. Sweet dreams.